For the first time ever, we're inviting you to join us on one of our adventures. And what better place to start than one of my favourite destinations, Portugal. But we're not just going for the beaches and the wine, we're following in the footsteps of one of history's most enigmatic organisations, the Knights Templar. That's right, we're going on the Trail of the Templars in Portugal. Over 5 days and 4 nights, we'll guide you from the winding streets of Lisbon to the hilltop castle of Almirol, the sacred halls of Tamar's Convent of Christ, and the enchanting, esoteric grottos of Quinta de Reguleira, the very place that inspired my book, The Templar Enigma. Now, this is no big group tour. There are just 6 spots available, and at the time of recording, only 2 remaining. If you want to secure one of them, head to lukerichardsonauthor.com/Templar tour right now. lukerichardsonauthor.com/Templar tour. What if I told you I knew the location of the Garden of Eden? Or rather, I knew someone willing to tell us. The story of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden is one of the oldest we have. In the Bible, it's described as the place where humankind began. A paradise lost right at the beginning of human history. But is that really where the story ends? What if it doesn't, though? What if the garden remained long after Adam and Eve left, its location passed down through the generations in a code that simply needed to be followed to find Earth's original paradise? You know what I'd say? Let's go on an adventure and see what we find. Hey, I'm Luke. I'm an author of archaeological adventure novels. I travel the world looking for stories to put into my books and to share with you right here on the Adventure Story podcast. Just quickly before we dive into today's show, if you would like some more adventure in your life, I'd love to welcome you inside of the Adventure Society. This weekly newsletter is your ticket to travel with me, to share my real-world adventures, and to find out first when a new story or a new season of this podcast drops. Check the link in the show notes to join the Adventure Society today. This is the kind of story then that makes an archaeological thriller writer like me sit up and pay attention. I love the idea that the truth is out there just waiting for the right person to follow the map and find it. And I love not knowing what might be waiting for us if we do make that journey. So, is it true that the Garden of Eden is still out there? Can we really follow 1,000-year-old clues across mountains, following rivers through a landscape that hasn't changed in all that time? Today, we're going to find out. David Rohl is our guide, an Egyptologist, historian and best-selling author whose work on ancient Egypt and the Near East has challenged how we understand the ancient world. He's taken the story of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden and followed its clues out into the real world, setting out on an expedition across the Zagros Mountains and into western Iran in search of the place where, quite literally, it all began. David, welcome to the Adventure Story podcast.
Nice to be here, Luke. We'll have a nice chat, I'm sure.
Yes, it's wonderful to be able to talk about this, and what an intriguing subject to connect over.
Yeah, it's one that I didn't expect to be doing, to be quite honest, because I'm an Egyptologist by training, but I got caught up in this. It's proved to be quite an adventure because actually I went to Iran 7 times to explore the region and to try and answer questions about those early stories in the book of Genesis.
So tell me about that. What was that expedition like? Where did you go, and what were you looking for?
Well, obviously, it's quite pertinent these days, isn't it, to talk about Iran. Back in the 90s, when I did these expeditions originally, you normally would fly into Tehran, the capital up in the north, and then you drive due south. And it takes about 5 or 6 hours before you reach the beautiful city of Isfahan, which is called half the world by Hafez. It's a gorgeous place, absolutely gorgeous. And then onward down from there to Shiraz, where you get the wine from, the original place where Shiraz wine came from.
Oh, interesting.
Again, a beautiful city. Lots of wonderful mosaics on the walls of the mosques and the palaces, etc. And then you hit Persepolis of the ancient Persian Empire. So Persepolis, the city that Alexander, in a drunken mood, went and burned the whole place down. But that's an extraordinary place. So I'm still heading south. I'm going all the way down now to Pasargadae, where Cyrus's tomb is located, the famous King Cyrus. And then you hit the oil fields and gas fields of what's called Khuzestan. You get lots of stans in this story. And that's the place where all the trouble is at the moment with the fighting over the oil. Tricky place to drive through, to be honest. We were on one of the expeditions, we were actually arrested for taking a look at one of these burners going off in near to the road. But anyway, that's another story. And then eventually we end up right in Mesopotamia, down in the south, at a place called Ahwaz on the Karun River. Now, that is the starting point, really, of the journey. So all this bit before that is just simply to get to the beginning. And then we head through the Zagros Mountains north, through 7 different passes. They're called gates in the ancient world. So you go through 7 gates to reach heaven. And that's the idea of it. So it's the 7 levels of heaven. So when you're in 7th heaven, you're in the Garden of Eden.
Yes.
So you pass through all these different gateways, through the different ranges of the mountains, and you eventually end up in the northwest of Iran, in a province called Azerbaijan province, and that's really where the story comes to its finale. But the idea is to tell you all about that journey from Ahwaz all the way back up to the northwest of Iran.
Oh, that's fantastic. Just before we sort of dive into the story on a historical level, what's it like traveling in that region? Because I know it was some time ago, but I think we get an impression, I imagine the impression we get from the news is not the impression that it is like on the ground, sort of driving through the towns and villages and eating in the restaurants and staying in the lodging houses or whatever and meeting the people out in the real world.
Well, that's true to a degree. Ever since the Ayatollahs came to power, and of course this was in the period of when Khomeini had just become the second Ayatollah, it was tricky business because we're going through areas which are not traveled by tourists at all. It was quite dangerous at times. We were chased by gun smugglers at one point. We were almost arrested having a meal one evening by one of the higher guards of the region who shoved his gun in my stomach as an interview start. That's how he started the interview, by putting a gun in my stomach. So it can be quite difficult, but I have to say that it is the most stunning, beautiful countryside, absolutely majestic. And if it wasn't for all the troubles that Iran has gone through for the last 30 or 40 years, it would be a massive tourist attraction. There's no doubt about that.
Mm-hmm.
So the people themselves are very friendly, but unfortunately the regime is not. And we took a bit of a risk doing this, of course, because quite a few foreigners have been arrested and thrown in prison for many years, but we were okay. We had a few exciting adventures, put it that way.
Going back to the start then, we all know the story of the Garden of Eden. It's taught in schools around the world, isn't it? The Adam and Eve and the serpent and the apple and all these things. But what makes you think that it's not just a story? What makes you think that it is embedded in a real place, or it comes from a real place?
Right. Well, let's start by saying I'm not a religious fanatic, okay? So the stories are more about culture than they are anything else, I think. So, yeah, then the main reason, I suppose, was as an archaeologist, I know very well that this region we're talking about, which we're going to travel to, was the place where the Neolithic revolution took place, where we started to see cultivation of crops, rearing of animals. And it was like the settlement down in villages, all began in this region. So the growing of einkorn for the first time, the domestication of sheep and goats, etc., cattle, all happen in this region we're going to. So it's almost like the beginning of humanity is located in that area, or the beginning of civilization, if you like. So that was a major clue to start off with. But there are many other clues about where this Garden of Eden and the land of Eden was located. And I suppose we'll go through that as we get further along the journey. But it basically starts with the second chapter of the book of Genesis, where we have this very matter-of-fact explanation of where Eden is located. It's no miracles involved here. It just says, basically, that the land of Eden was where the 4 sources of great rivers had their beginnings. The headwaters of those rivers start in the land of Eden. Now, 2 of those rivers are very famous, the Euphrates and the Tigris. So all you have to do, really, is to trace those rivers back to their sources, and you're in the land of Eden. So that's what I did.
Ah, I see. But you were groundbreaking in doing this, am I to understand that correctly? People had misinterpreted this in ways before or looked for it in different places.
I'd received a paper by somebody called Reginald Walker, who was a scholar who dealt in this region but had never been there himself. Sadly, he died, I think, in 1989. So I'd read his paper and I thought he'd got some very sensible and interesting ideas. So that was the start of it, really. I mean, I wasn't intending to go up to Iran and go and look at all these places, but I was convinced he was onto something. So what I did was saying, right, okay, now we need to put boots on the ground. We need to go to these places and look for ourselves and see what we can find.
Yeah, yeah. I love that. And I think as a writer, I really talk a lot about what it feels like to go to the place, what it feels like to stand on the Giza Plateau or in the mountains of Peru or whatever. And I think that sort of changes it. As a writer and a researcher yourself, do you think you have to go there to experience something, or do you feel like you could do that from reading other people's accounts or from a textbook, essentially?
No, you've got it absolutely right. And the academics who live in their ivory towers and never go to the place they study is really crazy. You've got to be in the places where these stories come from, whether they're legends or real history. I mean, this is the area that Alexander passed through, Alexander the Great. The Persian Empire was there. The Elamite civilization was in this region as well. And we know it's the beginnings of civilization up there in these mountains. So you've got to go and see what it's like. You've got to understand how the history evolved, even if it's mostly legendary.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right there. So we're all dying to know, what did you find when you got to the seventh gate, the seventh level, driving across these mountains? What was there?
Well, first of all, it was a heck of a difficult journey. We were in a 4x4 vehicle traveling up through these mountain ranges, through these 7 gates that led to heaven, effectively. You're going through Luristan, for starters. So we've been through Khuzestan, the oil fields. Now we're in Luristan, going up to the ancient city of Susa, which is the Elamite capital. And that was a place where Daniel of the Lion's Den was living. He was there in ancient Susa and was buried there. So we went to visit his shrine, his tomb. That was a remarkable thing. You get a figure from the Bible, and there you are standing in front of his tomb. And then from there, we just set off following the rivers, basically, because the rivers cut their way through these mountains. So the journey took several days, up through Luristan, which is where the robbers were chasing us, the smugglers with weapons were chasing us for about 4 hours. In our vehicle, we've been chased along in the back behind us by this truck. It wasn't very pleasant, I have to say. And then we end up in Kurdistan, the land of the Kurds, where their capital, Sanandaj, is located. Now, they're a tough folk. They're a really hard, tough people. And they've been there for centuries and centuries. They've been right the way back to the ancient Babylonian times they were there. And then eventually you cut through all these mountain ranges and you end up on something called the Mian Doab Plain. And that basically is a place that's mentioned in all the ancient texts. It's called the land of Aratta. So the legendary texts from ancient Sumer talk about an emissary going to the land of Aratta from the city of Uruk, where he's bringing back the statue of the goddess Inanna back to Uruk. And that journey is basically what we did. We followed the journey that he made on his donkey all that way. It must have taken him months to do it. And he was taking a letter from a king called Enmerkar to the lord of Aratta, the land of Aratta. And he was the first postman in history. He was taking this letter all this way. It took him months to get there. And eventually you come to this magical place called Mian Doab and Aratta, where there was a magical city. It's almost like a fairy tale city. We've never been able to find it. We don't know where the city is, but it was in that region. And going on beyond that, you come to a lake called Lake Urumia or Urmia. And to the right of that, or to the east of that, is a fantastically beautiful valley called the Achi Chai Valley. Now, the Achi Chai Valley is surrounded by mountains on 3 sides. So you have 3 sides on where it's protected and enclosed. On the west side, you have this huge, great big lake, which is a volcanic lake. There's a volcano right in the middle of it. And it's on the edge of Iran and on the border with Turkey. So it's a very isolated place. But the capital city in that valley is called Tabriz, which you might have heard of. Famous for its carpets. It was on the route from China, one of the routes from China. So it was that valley which we realized was the so-called Garden of Eden, because it's to the east of the land of Eden, which is where all these 4 rivers have their sources. We actually traced those sources. And so Eden was a much bigger place. And the east of Eden was this valley called the Achi Chai Valley, which we think is the Garden of Eden, the place which was to the east of Eden.
Wow.
And there are various toponyms there, which we can go through in a minute, which tell us that this is the right location, because they're mentioned in the Bible.
Yeah, tell me that. So you sort of definitively were able to tick off this list of things that said, this is it, check, this is it, check, etc.
Absolutely. Well, the story is all about a river that flows through the Garden of Eden, and then it divides to make these 4 headwaters, these 4 rivers, 2 of which are the Euphrates and Tigris. Well, we had to trace and find out which were the other 2 rivers, the Pishon and the Gihon. Well, the Gihon was dead easy because it's still called the Gai-hun Aras, even today. And it flows through the land of Cush, according to the story in Genesis. And the mountains in that area are called Cush-Yadag, which means the mountains of Cush. So all these locations are there in this area. And if you go to the east of this valley of Achi Chai, where Tabriz is located, you go through a mountain pass protected by a huge volcano called Savalan volcano, where there's furious storms, lightning bolts come crashing down from there. We had to drive through that pass with these lightning storms and thunder clapping around. And we ended up in a place called Nodi, which is an area near Ardabil, and that is the land of Nod. The land of Nod, of course, is where Cain was exiled from the Garden of Eden, and it's to the east of Eden. And again, this is to the east of Eden. The land of Nod, or Nodi, was to the east of this valley we've been talking about, protected by this volcano with the flashing sword of lightning, as the Bible says.
Wow. Yeah. What point did you know? Did you realize this is it? Did you know before you went? You must have been quite confident, but was there a point you remember on that journey that you were just like, we found it. This is where it all began?
Well, I was pretty sure of it in the first place, but I suppose the most momentous thing was the very place we went to, because looking down on this valley was another volcano, much nearer to the lake, to the south of the valley, and it's called Sahand volcano. It's a perfectly circular volcano, and the volcanic top of the mountain of this volcano is called the Mountain of the Chalice because it's full of water. The original vent of the volcano is full of water up there. It's a stunning thing, and it's snow-capped. And we went all the way up this mountain to near the summit, within a few hundred meters of the summit, and there we found what's called a troglodyte village called Kandovan. Now, Kandovan in ancient Persia means the honeycomb because it's made out of lava. So you have all this pumice and lava, and the people who've been living there for centuries, if not millennia, have carved their homes into the lava. So it's a village of cave dwellers, and they've been there forever. And the stream that comes from that volcanic chalice, the top of the mountain, flows down into the valley and becomes the river of the Garden of Eden. So looking at that place, seeing it, the history behind it, the legends behind it, I was convinced at that point that it couldn't be anywhere else. And then, of course, we get the reference in Ezekiel in the Bible, which talks about humanity coming from the high place, the mountain of God, where the hot coals are. Now, what sort of mountain has hot coals? Well, it's a volcano. So it's talking about the descent of humanity, i.e. the people of Eden, down into Mesopotamia. And that's actually mentioned in Ezekiel, and they become the Canaanites of the Bible.
Wow. Yeah. So when you came back to the university where you were working, or back to England, whatever, did everyone agree with you? Was this well received, or did you have some sort of people who were like, you can't have found it, it's not possible?
No, this is academia, for goodness sakes. Nobody agrees about anything. No, basically, there's another theory, which people also have, and it seems to be more accepted by academia, though it's really boring. And that is the Persian Gulf, where all the trouble is at the moment, used to be dry land. And what the Straits of Hormuz was originally was blocked. And then the ocean, the Indian Ocean, flowed into and drowned the Garden of Eden. That's the other theory by Eberhard Zanger. Now, that's followed by most historians. But what evidence have they got? Nothing, because it's under the water. They can't remove the water. They argue that the 4 rivers that come into this area, the Persian Gulf, it's their headwaters, but in fact they're estuaries, which is nonsense, because the Hebrew word roshim, which is heads, refers to the starts of the rivers, not the ends of the rivers. So they've got it in reverse, completely in reverse. So they're talking about the four rivers, the Euphrates, Tigris, Pishon and Gihon, coming into this area and flowing into it. Whereas in fact, the Bible tells us it flows out from the Eden is where you locate Eden. So it doesn't make any sense, but that's the professional or academic view. Many people do follow my arguments on this, but of course, they're not the ones that matter. It's the academics in their ivory towers who've never been to these places that hold the fort, as it were.
Yeah, no, I agree with you there. I agree with you there. If you could definitively prove it, though, I don't know, you went there and you found something. I'm an archaeological thriller writer. I love the idea that there's relics buried that we can find and prove things right. What would that change? If you could show this to those academics and say, look, this was there, what would it change?
They know very well that the Neolithic revolution began there. They know very well that the first cultivation of crops was there. Don't forget the Cain and Abel story. Abel, the farmer who grew crops, Cain, who had sheep and cattle, etc., and was the shepherd, and the conflict between the two of them. That's the age-old story of city dwellers versus agriculturists. Cain was the city dweller. He went and was exiled and became a builder of cities. Abel was the one who was murdered, and his successors were the ones who were the shepherds, who were in fact the patriarchs who came down from the mountains and settled in northern Mesopotamia. So we have all that. We know that was the area where viniculture first began, where fruit farming began, where they cultivated orchards, where they looked after animals, where they domesticated dogs, etc., all in that area. So we know it's where the beginnings of civilization were, but there's a more important thing, I think, here, which is probably what you're getting at. And that is that the people in this prehistoric times, when they died, their bodies were laid out for the carrion birds to come and pick the flesh off the bones. And when the bones were cleaned, they were placed in the ground. But they, first of all, before they were placed in the ground, they were painted with red ochre. Now, these mountains that surround this valley I talked about are made of red ochre. They shine like a beautiful red color in the sun, on the sunset and sunrise. And what people did was they mixed this soil, this red earth, with water and painted the bones to restore life to the dead by bringing the blood back to them. This is what you see in all the graves in that period. Now, the name Adam is actually based on that because it basically means the man of the red earth. That's what Adam means. So these people in this region are reflected by the first biblical human on the earth, which of course is a fictionalized version, but it actually originates with this idea of these people who lived in the red earth land and were buried covered in red earth in the restoration blood of the ochre. So this area is the only place you find that.
And presumably the people that are listed in the Bible and other texts from that period are there, right? Their remains are there beneath the soil or wherever, within that valley.
Yeah, I mean, basically, what Adam is just basically the 10th generation before Noah. That's all we know about him. And all that means is that Noah, or whoever, maybe even Abraham, because he's the 20th generation after Adam, all they simply knew, they learned by rote their ancestral lineage going back to this person called Adam. And they never went further back than that. They couldn't. That's where their genealogy ended, with their learning it by rote, passing it down from one generation to the next. So Adam is basically the figurehead of this civilization, or this beginnings of civilization in that area. They become more historical when you reach the patriarchal period, when we have an Abraham and an Isaac and a Jacob, and of course then Joseph, etc. in Egypt. So then it becomes much more historical. But this earlier period, a lot of the information we learned about it actually comes from the ancient Mesopotamian texts. So it's not just in the book of Genesis. So we have them in tablets from ancient Sumer, ancient Mesopotamia, that talk about things like the Great Flood and God coming and whispering in the ear of the flood hero to build an ark and save himself and civilization from disaster. That's all in Mesopotamian texts. That's not just in the Bible. So the origins of all this are back in the midst of time, but the physical evidence, not of individuals, but of the process of coming from hunter-gatherers to domesticating animals and planting crops, is in the story of Cain and Abel and Adam and Eve.
Yeah, this is absolutely fantastic, absolutely fascinating stuff. I'm so intrigued by this story. Just a quick one about your sort of trips there. Did the people you meet, do they understand, or do they, I want to say this in a way that it doesn't sound patronizing or sort of negative, but like, do they appreciate the importance of the place in which they live? Do they know that? Are they aware of that? Or if to them, is it just a sort of normalized thing like all the places we live are normalized, aren't they? Because we see them every day.
You've hit the magic button, actually. I'm going to tell you a story now.
Oh, wow.
When I published my book, The Legend, the Genesis of Civilization, there was an American entrepreneur who contacted me. And he said that he had the money to do this, that he was going to go to this village of Kandovan up on top of that mountain with the spring water coming down into the Garden of Eden. And he was going to bottle Eden water. So he was going to get the water from this spring, which apparently for generations and generations has been regarded as being a healing property, this water has. Because in Tabriz, the old ladies climb up this mountain and collect the water from there to look after the ailments of the sick in Tabriz. So it's got these healing qualities according to them. So when he applied to build this bottling factory in Tabriz, at just the foot of the mountain, he had to apply to the Iranian government. And he wrote the story about my work and research, and it got to the ears of the Ayatollah Khomeini. And Ayatollah Khomeini, the one who's just been killed, he actually declared that the location that I'd given there in Tabriz, in that valley, and also the mountain, was in fact the Garden of Eden. He declared it officially in his state, as the leader of that state and the leader of the religious order, that this was the place where the Eden story came from.
Wow. Yeah. So it's quite well recognized then in the local area.
It is through official circles, but I mean, that's a different thing. The local people, of course, they just believe in the medicinal properties of the water, but they don't know it's connected to Adam and Eve and all that stuff. But of course, an Ayatollah would be well read in the verses of the Quran, etc. And so he would be very familiar with the geography, etc. And he declared it to be official that this was the place where Adam and Eve, Cain and Abel, and the Garden of Eden were located.
Oh, wow. That's it, isn't it? That's fascinating. So interesting. What you saw, I'm curious about this. Did what you saw and what you discovered there and sort of the connections you were able to make between text and reality, have they changed the way that you see stories like this? We've got loads, haven't you? You've mentioned in the Bible, obviously, we've got sort of the Epic of Gilgamesh and such like this. Has it changed the way that you think about these as myth or as memory or as storytelling or as an oral history or as actually like real events that were written down for future generations?
Well, there you came across the right words again. You talked about myth, for instance. Myth is, when we define myth, it's basically the ideas of an individual about strange and exotic things like dragons or Mount Olympus where the gods were living, and they're not based on reality, on history. Whereas legenda, is based on real historical events, and it's elaborated upon and exaggerated, of course. But essentially, it's traditional history as opposed to documented history. So legend is what I deal with, not myth. I don't deal with the mythological side. That's the gods of Olympus. Forget that for as far as I'm concerned. But I do think within the stories of legend, you have the grains of truth about what happened in the past. But it's not necessarily documented. Remember that prehistory is pre-writing. So when we come to history, it's when writing first took place. Initially, it was just for bookkeeping, but eventually it became literature. With the Gilgamesh epic, for instance, where you actually have a narrative. And of course, that develops into something like the Bible and the stories in Genesis. So they're based on legends. They're based on traditional oral traditions, oral histories. And I think they're well worth investigating. They're not mythologies. Okay, so if you go into these places and you search these places and you research the ancient documentations, you can start to see where the history is. It's not all history, but most of it is.
Yeah, that's it. Well, there's a sort of challenge in there, isn't there? To sort of pick apart these local legends that you put it and these things, the stories that you've heard even in your family on a local level about something or another, something that we all have in our societies and in our lives, aren't they?
Yeah, exactly. And we carry a traditional history of our own families. Okay, it's not necessarily documented anywhere, but that's what the ancients did as well. But they're much better at it than we are because we have television and other distractions. They didn't have that. as far as they were concerned, it was very important to remember their ancestors, going back as many generations as 20 generations. They did that in Egypt, they did that in Mesopotamia, because that was important to them. It was who they were, was related to who they'd come from. So in other words, people, their descent from somebody was very important to them. Therefore, for instance, in the case of the Israelites, they descend from Abraham down to Jacob, who became Israel, and they become Israelites. And then later on, when the Romans are in Judea, they become Jews. A different word entirely from Israelites. So their tradition and the current, going from A to B to C to D to E is what they remembered. And how they remember their culture. And it was an oral tradition much of the time. They would tell these stories, like Homer would tell the story of the Trojan War. Everybody believed that was nonsense until they started digging Hisarlik. And now we actually have clear evidence there was a Trojan War there.
Yeah, a real fascinating part of history. So, David, I ask everyone this question on the podcast, and I love it because it's a really nice through line that connects all of the people that I have a conversation with. Looking back, what adventure stories, whether they were books or movies or legends, oral legends that you were told as a child, which ones of these first sparked your imagination and made you want to go on adventures like the one that you shared with us today?
Well, I have to go back to when I was 7 years old, I'm afraid. When I was 7 years old, my mum bought me a book. It was by Christine de Roche-Noble-Court, and it was about the discovery of King Tutankhamun's tomb, with all the artifacts that were found in that tomb. And I read that from cover to cover. And at the age of seven years old, I was writing Egyptian hieroglyphs. I was writing the names of every Egyptian king in hieroglyphs, and also in Greek, and also in English. So I had this great chart of all these Egyptian pharaohs. I went to Egypt for the first time at the age of 9. And my mum and I sailed down up to Abu Simbel from Cairo in King Farouk's paddle steamer, because he'd been kicked out of the country in the revolution. And so this beautiful paddle steamer was actually berthed at the side in Cairo, the quayside, and we commandeered it and we sailed all the way to Abu Simbel in Upper Egypt. So my grounding as a child was in Egyptology. I loved the whole civilization. Going to Abu Simbel, going into the Valley of the Kings and entering the tomb of King Seti I. All those things were imbued in me at a very young age, at 9 years old. And so I've lived with Egyptology all my life. I've been to Egypt hundreds of times. I've lost count how many times. So my beginnings are there with that single book. And I encourage people to think about the books that have influenced them throughout their lives and what they've done about it once they've read it. I certainly did a lot. I actually went from reading that book to actually investigating the entire civilization at a very young age. And ever since then, I've been traveling the ancient Near East and the Middle East today in all the different civilizations, studying them all from the Greeks, the Mycenaean Greeks, to the Trojan War and the Hittites and the Minoans in Crete, the biblical stories from Israel, the Phoenicians, all those different civilizations I've studied because I just simply love ancient history.
That's so fascinating. And I love the way that you can pull that back to your that book when you're 7. Isn't there a saying about show me a 7-year-old and I'll show you the man? It's really been a through line through your life.
I've just been watching that series again, actually. I think they're up to about the age of 56 or 65 now or something like that. But It's absolutely true. It is absolutely true. The inspiration of a lifetime begins at 7 years old.
Yeah, fascinating. I love that so much. So tell me, David, where can people find you and the book specifically? I know the book that relates to the conversation we've had today specifically, should they want to learn more?
Well, some of these books were published back in the 1990s. My book, A Test of Time, came out and was a big bestseller. It was the number 2 in the Sunday Times bestseller list for 8 weeks, and which was quite unusual for a history book, I tell you. And of course, we had the TV series called Pharaohs and Kings as well. So that's when my writing career started, my TV presenting career started. But the second book was this one, Legend, The Genesis of Civilization, which was in the 1990s, published in the 1990s. And of course, that's when I was doing all these explorations in Iran and Persia. But I've gone on from there, and I've done lots of other books since then, particularly interested in the biblical narratives of Exodus and the sojourn of the Israelites in Egypt. So I've done a lot of research in that. And those books are basically available on Amazon. Sadly, many of them are out of print now, so you can only get them as ebooks, but they're still worth having as ebooks. If you want to read this material, then maybe the paperbacks are still available, I'm not sure, but Amazon is the place to go and get yourself an ebook. That would be great.
Wonderful. David, thank you so much for making the time today.
That's my pleasure. It's been great fun. Thank you.
What an interesting conversation. What a fascinating guest on the show today. I absolutely love things like this. I feel like we're peeling back the layers of history, and that for me is exactly why I have conversations like this. And there are so many ideas for great adventure books in there, isn't there? So this is the Adventure Story Podcast. Thank you so much for hanging out with me today. If you've enjoyed the show, please do subscribe, please like, and please share. It'll take you just seconds, but really helps me spread the word about this show. If you have a story you'd like me to explore, let me know in the comments or via email, hello@lukerichardsonauthor.com. And if you need a little more adventure in your life, and let's be honest, who doesn't, you might like to join the Adventure Society. This weekly newsletter is your ticket to travel with me, to share real-world adventures, and to find out first when a new story or a new season of this podcast drops. lukerichardsonauthor.com/adventure society is where you need to go for that. And if you're a fan of adventure stories like the one we've talked about today, check out my books at lukerichardsonauthor.com.